thank you so much for offering your time for this. Just by way of introduction, Arnold Kling, of course, the author of the book that we've been reading this semester. He has a really bright career. He has been manager of Freddie Mac. He has been an internet entrepreneur. He has also been an economist with the Fed. And so some folks were asking about the odds of a recession this semester or this year. Maybe we'll visit that after the book. But also he has a blog online, so and several other books, and maybe we'll get around to talking about what other books might fit a club of misfits like us. But anyway, thank you. Could we all give Arnold a round of applause before he starts? And so with that, I'll turn things over. We all have questions, but I thought you may have a few things that you wanted to say. If not, we'll get right into the questions.
Well, I just want to talk for maybe 2 or 3 minutes. First of all, just thanks for honoring me by reading the book, choosing the book for your group. I wrote a first edition of this book about a little over 6 years ago. And at that time, I maybe even didn't know quite what I was writing, because I was thinking of it mostly as a book about politics. And as it has evolved, I think it's mostly a book about psychology. So you could call it political psychology, if you will. And just as a general observation on psychology, you can say that an interesting goal that you can have when you have a disagreement, and this could be a disagreement with someone in your family, with a friend, with anyone, an interesting goal would be to really understand where the other person's coming from. Now, I wouldn't say that out loud. I really want to understand where you're coming from, because that just sounds sarcastic. But that would be a goal. There was a popular book a number of years ago called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And one of the habits was, this is by Stephen Covey, one of the habits was seek first to understand, then to be understood. And I would just cut off the last half and just say, seek first to understand. So imagine you're in some kind of disagreement. Just set yourself, all I want to get out of this disagreement is to understand what the other person's point of view is. Because that's a very different way. Somehow your ego wants to defend itself, or you just want to win the argument in some sense, but changing it to sort of trying to genuinely understand the other person, it's an interesting way to think about approaching a disagreement. And let me throw out a question. Did anyone remember something called the law of asymmetric insight? Okay, let's go back to, was it McGill? Is that, or who?
I think he's talking about you.
Jackson. Oh, I mean Jackson.
Jackson, sorry. Yeah, did you raise your hand? What was the law of asymmetric insight?
It's the law that there's 2 different ones I'm thinking of. I hope the first one that I say is right. It's that whenever people will learn more about a topic, they'll become more pigeonholed towards their side of the issue, whereas people who actually know less about a topic might not be as dug in.
Okay, now that deals more with confirmation bias.
Right.
So that is one of the things. What about, so Ryan, do you want to take a shot at what the law of asymmetric insight is?
Well, sure. Yeah, I thought it was really insightful. It's the idea that I believe that I know more about the way the other side works than they know about themselves. And of course, that's true about both sides.
Yeah.
And not everyone can be right.
So the idea is I have an insight into why you really are the way you are. And my insight gives me more knowledge than you have about the way you are. That's this belief that we come at. So you'll see that in politics. If you read a column by Paul Krugman, he will tell you what conservatives are really like. No conservative would recognize themselves in any Paul Krugman column, but he will tell you that he knows what they're really like. And if you listen to Rush Limbaugh on the radio, he'll tell you what liberals are really all about. And again, no liberal would recognize themselves in the description that Rush Limbaugh makes. So that's this notion of asymmetric insight. And what I'm suggesting about trying to genuinely understand where the other person's coming from is to try to get yourself away from obeying this law of asymmetric insight and thinking that you know more about the other person than the other person knows about themselves. And that, again, that's just an interesting psychological characteristic that we have, and I think it's part of a way of defending our ego and resisting opening our minds or changing our minds. So anyway, I just throw that out again to illustrate that this is really turning into a book about psychology. Having done that, let's open it up to questions.
When you were writing the book, did you go into it with a mindset of, I know exactly what I am? Or did you go into it and kind of figure out what categories there were and then just kind of realize which one you were?
I went into writing this book. This was probably 6 years ago. I was probably in my most libertarian phase. I think I've been, and perhaps the reason I was able to write the book was that I've been sort of all three at one point or another. I was certainly a progressive when I was in my teens and 20s. I became somewhat conservative in my 30s, although not really. Then became libertarian, I guess rather late in life. I was not an Ayn Rand libertarian. Sort of taking the view that the libertarian answer is often the best answer. And then more recently, I think I've become a sort of a conservatarian, sort of half conservative, half libertarian.
In the book, you establish a system where there's essentially three axes of political thought. You have the progressive axis, the conservative axis, and the libertarian axis. When you were writing the book, did you already have these three ideas of the axes in heart, or were there other? What led you to settle on these three axes?
As best I can remember, I believed that there were three kind of intellectual strains in American politics having to do with a conservative strain, which I thought I understood, the progressive strain, and the libertarian strain. I think I'd already formed the oppressor-oppressed story about progressives. I think I came up with that years before the book. I'm not sure when I came up with the civilization, barbarism, and liberty coercion axes. I think that was probably right before or while I was writing the book.
Of the three tribes, the three axes, are there any two that would, I guess, be more eager to communicate or have an easier time speaking the same language? And are there any two that would have just the hardest time, I guess, hold each other the most content?
That's an interesting question. Off the top of my head, I guess libertarians tend to describe themselves as sort of progressive on social issues and conservative on economic issues. So I think the libertarians offhand would probably have the easiest time conversing with the others. And I think the conservatives and progressives definitely talk past each other the most. So, when Donald Trump gave a speech, I think it was in 2017, so he's president, and he gave maybe his first major foreign policy speech, and it was a big defense of Western values and how Western values are under threat. And that resonated perfectly with conservatives. It was the first time that conservatives really felt truly comfortable with Donald Trump, but to the extent that they did. Some didn't. That wasn't enough to make them feel comfortable. Progressives' reaction was, it's just, racism. He's just, that just confirms that he's a racist. So I think the the progressives and conservatives have the hardest time accepting one another or speaking the same language.
Did you have a specific motive when you had the idea to write this book, or like, was there anything that happened politically or personally that made you want to write something to help people like communicate more effectively across the political spectrums?
I think what triggered it was when I just stepped back and looked at, what pundits like, Paul Krugman or Victor Davis Hanson or other people were doing. And Krugman in particular, I just thought he was acting as if his biggest fear was that some other point of view would seep into his readers. And he's just trying so as hard as he can to close their minds to other points of view. That was just kind of, again, that would be an asymmetric insight. I don't think that's, if you asked Paul Krugman what he's up to, he would say that, although sometimes he seems to come close. But anyway, it was that sense, and I said, boy, there's all this political commentary going on. And, if you were to sit in a philosophy class at a university, the philosophy professor is not trying to close your mind. They're trying to show you how different philosophers bring different perspectives to issues. And, if you've ever sat on a jury, or if you ever sit on a jury, you'll see that people are really trying to wrestle with the issue and genuinely listen to the other juror's point of view, try to change their mind, try to have an open mind themselves. So it just struck me that political dialogue is just the opposite of that. And it's trying to close the minds of the people on your own side. And so when I first wrote the book, I was just trying to describe that process and how it worked. And then with the latest edition, I tried to bring in more of the psychological elements because I just was reading more about it. And actually, there's another edition that will be coming out later this year. And it mostly includes an afterword where I list some of the writing that's taken place in political psychology over the last couple of years that I've noticed. It's, there's some in the press, and then there's been some academic work. I haven't kept up with all the academic work, but it's just an exploding field. I mean, when I first wrote this, I don't think the phrase political psychology meant anything to me. Now it's clearly a booming field.
So it seems like we're having kind of an anti-elitist moment right now. The whole thing with enrollment in the high-end college education type thing. You wrote a little bit about this in your book, but how do you think that sort of populism, anti-elitism fits in the axes, or have you had any opportunity to think a little bit more carefully about that?
Yes, I have, and I talk a bit more about it in the forthcoming book, not a whole lot more. I would say stylistically, the opposition between what I call the Bobos and the anti-Bobos, that's from an old book, or a 20-year-old book by David Brooks called Bobos in Paradise. And a Bobo is a bohemian bourgeois. So it's sort of like the grown-up hippies who became the elite. This is kind of what he had in mind. So just, you think of a Bobo as the elite, even though Bobo doesn't sound very elite. And then the anti-Bobos would be, Trump supporters, people who really, they can tell that they're being looked down on and they're kind of tired of it. So I think that the same kind of opposition and distrust and maybe even different languages applies. I don't think that there's that much of an intellectual tradition behind really either one. I mean, there's not much of an intellectual tradition, at least in the United States, of defending elitism. I guess, maybe Alexander Hamilton, I think, didn't he talk about a natural aristocracy, or did I have the wrong founding father there? But America has always at least pretended that it was anti-elitist, and there's always been a big component of the population that's anti-elitist. That's some demographers refer to Greater Appalachia, because the people who settled in Appalachia were very prolific in terms of breeding, and they spread out very far west. And so their descendants all throughout the South and West, and there's a lot of American culture that's tied in with that, and it's very, very anti-elitist and very independent. You know, think of people trying to, you know, when the revenuer comes to collect money from the still, they, you know, they come out with a shotgun and tell the person from the government to go away. So that, you know, that culture has spread, you know, and it's located in large parts of the country. And, you know, so in some sense that culture, you know, helped elect Trump. So there is that opposition, but I don't think there's a big intellectual tradition, because nobody in America wants to write anything defending elites. I mean, David Brooks will, but probably just about no one else will. And the populists don't typically have an articulated intellectual movement. So in that sense, it differs from the other three axes, but there is this clear opposition and quite a culture war going on. Okay.
When you were writing the book, did you find it more difficult to connect to one of the axes?
That's an interesting question. Probably the one I have the most difficulty connecting with or giving respect to is the progressive one, just because I think contemporary progressivism to me is so foreign. I think it's actually, I mean, it's foreign to, I think, a lot of people who were progressives when I was younger and who still identify as Democrats or as liberals today. I think they have a hard time with the, you know, the rapid change in sort of gender ideology in particular. I mean, I talked to, had dinner where there was a prominent liberal who's about, I guess, in his mid-30s, and he already feels old listening to 20-year-olds talk about the gender issues.
If you got the chance to do it all over again, would you write this book still, or would you write something else?
Of course, I did get a chance in some sense with this third edition. I think since I did most of that, you know, several months ago. It takes time. There's always a lag between writing and publication. So I think there's been enough time elapsed since I wrote it that I would do it. I think what I would do most is stress the psychology aspects of it and put less stress on the part that really appealed to me first at most and what appeals to most people now, which is the three axes. I mean, it's a cute thing to play with. It is fun to be able to read a pundit and say, aha, there they are, just pulling, you know, ringing the bell of civilization barbarism. I can see that. I mean, I think that's useful from the book, but I think the overall issues, the psychological issues and how we handle disagreement and how we mishandle disagreement, and particularly political disagreement, and the sort of the tribalism and tribal status issues, those are the issues that I think are most interesting, and I would try to put more of a focus and emphasis on those if I were doing it again.
Was this supposed to be like a sort of like teaching for younger people, like people who don't really understand the different parties, and be like, you can choose yours and see which axis you fall on, but kind of be open-minded in the future?
Well, I certainly wouldn't want to suggest that somebody try to pick a political viewpoint based on what axis appeals to them. If it's an advice book, and it is an advice book, it's an advice to notice your emotional reaction to a political statement and see if that emotional reaction lines up with an axis. So if you find yourself reacting very favorably to someone who says something expresses the language of civilization versus barbarism, recognize that you've got some conservative instincts, but say to yourself, okay, I've got these instincts, but there are other points of view. I'm not going to just jump up and down and say rah, rah, rah every time somebody uses the language I like. I'm going to step back, consider other points of view, and have respect for people who do have other points of view.
Well, I have a bunch of things that I want to talk about. So listen, gang, just stop me if you think of a question that you wanted to throw out there. One of the things I'd like to do is kind of tie what we read in your book back to some of the other books that we've read. And it was interesting to me. So you mentioned I think it was in the discussion about kind of, if we can call it that, the Trump movement. You mentioned Appalachia. And recently we read the book Hillbillyology. And so I want to touch on a couple of ways that your book interacts with that book. The first and foremost is that I think it's appropriate that this book was written by an economist. And it was only after a decade or so of teaching principles of economics that I realized what we're doing when we teach supply and demand. At its heart, we are trying to get the students to look at the world from two perspectives. There's one that they more readily identify with, which is the consumer perspective, and then there's a foreign one, which is the business perspective. And so tying that back to Hillbillyology, in Hillbillyology, the author, who was raised essentially, he says, by hillbillies in a broken home, his mom went through significant others on a weekly basis. There were drugs and abuse. Anyway, and so the book is about his rise to graduate from Yale Law and to do great things afterwards. But something that he kind of mentions as an aside was that when he was young, he could look at globalization and see that it was killing his Rust Belt town. But at the same time, he could realize that if he were the business owner, that he would utilize the cost savings associated with globalization to make his business more powerful and more profitable. So I guess what's your take on the idea and the power of, for a young person, and I don't know if it's causal or if it's just associated with folks that rise up, but do you think there's a link, I guess, between the ability to think about both sides of an issue and maybe even at an early age, and then your prospect to go on and maybe rise up beyond college level education? What do you think?
Well, it's a big question. I probably thought of 10 things I could say about it. The first thing I'll say is my own background. In the neighborhood that I grew up, I was really exposed to different cultures. Not different international cultures, but different within the United States. I remember people would just for entertainment, they would stage fights between 8-year-old boys on the carport, and a neighbor's mom smashed someone else's mother's head against the curb. I mean, so there's that. And in the same neighborhood, there were some very achievement-oriented, hardworking students that but I fell in with friends from kind of both groups, and so you can kind of see where at a very early age I was trying to navigate some very different cultures, and that's interesting. I think it happens much less nowadays. I don't think I can conceive of a neighborhood like that now where there's so much variety. I grew up in the St. Louis area, and in the 1960s, the price of the most expensive ticket at the St. Louis ballpark was in reach of any working class person. So wherever you sat in the ballpark, you would have people of all classes. And now, the most expensive seats are like $800, and no working class person can afford that, and they can barely afford the worst seats in the house. So it's just we've segregated to a tremendous extent in this country, and that's I think that really accentuates the political divides that we have.
Yeah. So there was another thing I wanted to talk about in terms of the tribes. So we have the two main tribes, right? And so I want to relate this back to a book that we read recently, Factfulness. I don't know if that's on your radar.
I know Rosling, but I haven't read that book.
It's a fantastic book. It's a book that got better and better as you read. But just the idea of fear.
He has some great YouTube videos too, by the way.
Yeah. So the idea that fear makes good thinking impossible. They will take the best of brains and just ruin their ability to move forward and to process things. So, I noticed that in your book, you touched on it briefly, but this idea of a fear bias, and we also seem to be drawn to fear in the news we consume, and et cetera, et cetera. So to what extent do you think fear drives the partitioning, either intentionally or unintentionally?
Probably, as I think about it, probably more than what I gave credit in the book. And I agree with you about the news media. If it bleeds, it leads. It really political competition is in some sense about stoking fears. If you talk about good things, you get some attention. But if you address people's fears or stimulate fears, then you really get a lot of attention. The story of Chicken Little is about somebody, chicken runs around saying the sky is falling. You wouldn't read a story about somebody who ran around saying that, oh, there's a beautiful, yellow rainbow over there. I mean, that's just, so bad news, frightening news, I think just from, an evolutionary survival point of view, we're more attuned to it. That's what we want to pay attention to, because that's what you had to pay attention to in prehistoric times in order to survive. And anyway, so that's the So I agree that really is an important important element and an unfortunate element in sort of politics and media these days. You did mention thinking about books.
Yes.
A very long book, but which I've recommended to a lot of people, is something called The Revolt of the Public by Martin Gurry. He finally came out with a print edition this year. You can look that one up. And I just got a review copy of a book by Tyler Cowen called Big Business, and some of the things you talked about sort of how an economics teacher is trying to get people to change their perspective on economic events. I think this is an attempt to change people's perspective on big business. It's a much breezier read than The Revolt of the Public, but I recommend that one.
Yeah, brevity is something that our students tend to celebrate. This has been by far the best attended. The students have always demonstrated knowledge of the content, and I think a lot of that is owed to not only how well it was written, but just how brief it was. They didn't have to go through 100 pages before each meeting. But
okay.
Yeah, so kudos, and can we all give Arnold a big hand for joining us? And I have so much I want to say. I think I'll end up maybe writing you a long-winded email, but thank you. And I appreciate your time. Certainly respect it. We'll talk later.
Okay, thank you. Enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.